I gave his teacher new breath in his old life. And in return, he made my son an honor student. My name is Hannah. I'm 43, married, and the kind of mother who shows up with cupcakes to parent-teacher night, even when no one asked for them. My son, Matthew, is 16. A good kid. Quiet. Not a genius, not a rebel, just one of those boys who floats through high school under the radar. Except this semester, he started slipping. C grades. Missed assignments. Teachers mentioning things like lack of engagement and needs initiative. It didn't sit right. So I made an appointment. One-on-one. With the teacher who had the most complaints, Mr. Dalton. He wasn't what I expected. Mid-50s, tall, trim, soft-spoken. The kind of man who probably still used a fountain pen and played vinyl at home. His office was lined with old books and a jazz station played low in the background. He stood when I entered. "Mrs. Lane, please have a seat." He offered tea. Actual tea. Loose leaf. I accepted. We talked about Matthew. His performance. His sudden dip. Dalton wasn't cruel, but he was honest. "Your son's smart. But smart isn't enough. He's floating. Coasting. He doesn't push himself because he doesn't think anyone expects him to." I felt that one. He poured more tea. "You seem tired," he said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" Not in a bad way. Just, like someone who hasn't heard their own name in a long time. I didn't know what to say. He smiled gently. Mothers often forget their women too. I left the office half an hour later, unsettled. And very awake. That night, I thought about the way his voice dipped when he said my name. The way he looked at me. Not through me. At me. I hadn't felt that in years. My husband, Gary, worked in construction. Honest, loud, exhausted by 7 p.m. every night. We barely talked anymore. We existed in the same house like polite roommates. That night, he was asleep on the couch before I finished making dinner. I sat alone, scrolled through emails, and stopped on one from Mr. Dalton. "Thank you for today. You reminded me what it's like to be seen." I reread it 4 times, then replied, "Likewise." The next day, Matthew got an A on his pop quiz. 2 days later, he turned in his missing assignments. Mr. Dalton said he thinks I can be top of the class. He told me casually over breakfast. My coffee paused halfway to my lips. "That's great, honey." He said you came by. Thought it helped. I nodded slowly. "Just a talk." Matthew smirked. "Whatever you said, it worked." He's been different. Nicer. Mr. Dalton emailed again. "Your son is progressing beautifully. You must be proud. Perhaps we could catch up again next week?" For continuity. Continuity. I replied yes. We met at a local bookstore. Not school. Neutral ground. He wore a jacket with suede elbows. I wore perfume I hadn't touched in years. We didn't talk about grades. We talked about poetry. About jazz. About missed opportunities. He touched my wrist when he made a point. Held it a second too long. When we parted. Soft. Respectful. It lingered. 2 days later, he sent Matthew home with a handwritten note. Folded. No name. Just. Tuesday. 7 p.m. My place. I stared at it. Waited until Matthew left the room. Then typed, "Are you sure?" He replied instantly. Always. His apartment was clean. Sparse. Books stacked on windowsills. Music playing. Candlelight flickering. He opened the door with a smile that felt like a secret. "You came." I shouldn't have. That's why it matters. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. A few days later, I returned to school under the pretense of helping Dalton sort Matthew's makeup work. It was late. The hallways were empty. The doors locked behind us with a soft, echoing click. We were in his classroom. Lights low. Jazz humming softly from a small speaker on his desk. I was flipping through test sheets, but we both knew this wasn't about schoolwork anymore. We stood closer than we should. His hand brushed mine, then lingered. And just as we leaned in, we heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Getting louder. Keys jingled. Then one stopped right outside the door. Dalton froze. I looked around, heart racing. "In here," he whispered, tugging me toward the storage cabinet. We slipped inside. The door creaked shut just as the classroom door opened. Through the slits in the wooden cabinet, I saw her. The janitor. She stepped in with her cart, humming off-key, pushed the mop slowly across the tile, oblivious to the two people holding their breath 6 feet away. We didn't move. Not even a blink. She wiped a desk, checked her phone, and eventually turned off the lights. When the door shut behind her, we stayed frozen. Then we exhaled. Together. And without a word, we stepped out of the dark. After that unforgettable and quietly dangerous night we spent hidden in the cabinet, pressed together in breathless silence while a janitor hummed her way around the dimly lit classroom, nothing between Mr. Dalton and me remained subtle, restrained, or even remotely within the boundaries we once pretended to respect. From that moment forward, the way we looked at each other shifted completely, and the text messages we exchanged late at night became more frequent, more suggestive, and increasingly laced with an urgency that neither of us acknowledged directly, but both understood deeply. I told myself again and again that this was all still somehow for Matthew, that his progress justified the sacrifices I was making, that his transformation into a star student gave my actions some kind of noble purpose. Even as the line between duty and desire blurred so completely I could no longer tell if it had ever truly existed. Then, one day, a new message came from Dalton, simple but loaded with implication. "Final exams are next week. These are the ones that matter most. No pleasantries. No disguises." He knew I would read between the lines, and I did. Matthew's future was riding on these exams, on his transcript, his summer program applications, the scholarships we could barely afford not to get, and suddenly, everything felt like it was hanging from a string that only one man could control. At the bottom of the message, he wrote, "Sunday, my place. You know why." My pulse slowed as I stared at the screen. He didn't ask. He expected. That night, while I stood at the sink washing the dinner dishes, Gary walked in, his boots still dusty from work, his expression unreadable as he glanced toward the phone I had carelessly left face up on the counter. "Who's texting you so late?" I didn't miss a beat. "Just school stuff," I replied, too quickly, too softly. He paused, watched me a little too long, then nodded, but didn't say another word. Something in his silence made my skin tighten. Over the next few days, I buried myself in helping Matthew study, printing mock exams, flipping flashcards across the dining table, quizzing him on formulas and historical dates, trying to stay in the role of the devoted mother, the responsible wife, the woman I once believed I was, but deep down, I could feel that role slipping through my fingers like water. Despite all our efforts, Matthew was still struggling, still second-guessing himself, still falling short of the edge he needed to push past the average and into excellence, and I hated that I started to believe there was a faster way, an easier way, even if it came wrapped in guilt and quiet betrayal. When Sunday arrived, the sky was the color of wet concrete, and rain tapped softly against the windshield as I drove to Dalton's apartment, each streetlight flashing across my dashboard like the beat of a warning I refused to heed. I told Gary I was going to help a friend, a lie so thin it nearly tore in my throat, and he only gave a quiet nod, his eyes never leaving the TV, but something about his stillness unnerved me more than if he had screamed. By the time I rang Dalton's buzzer, my palms were sweating, my legs shaking slightly beneath my coat, and when he opened the door, his smile was calm, confident, as if we hadn't been spiraling toward this moment for weeks, as if everything that came before was just a polite prelude. He poured wine into glasses that clinked too softly, and I took mine without a word, stepping into the apartment that now felt achingly familiar, books stacked along the windows, jazz curling through the air, and that same faint scent of cedar and aftershave that clung to him like memory. We didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. We both understood the exchange, the unspoken transaction that was already in motion, and so when his fingers brushed the hem of my dress and my breath hitched for only a moment, I didn't resist. Afterward, I sat by the window, watching drops trace slow paths down the glass, and he brought me another glass of wine, setting it beside me with a murmured toast I couldn't bring myself to echo. "To success," he said, raising his own. But as I reached for my purse, I noticed something across the street, a shape, a figure, barely visible behind the glinting blur of a parked car, gone the second I blinked, but real enough to twist my stomach into a knot I couldn't name. Back home, the house was too quiet. Gary was already sitting at the kitchen table, the laptop open, his face unreadable. I froze. He turned the screen toward me and hit play. The video was shaky, taken from a phone, but it was unmistakable. The angle was perfect, aimed straight at Dalton's second-story window, where the curtains hadn't been drawn, where my silhouette moved too clearly, where his hands found my waist, and mine returned the motion without hesitation. Everything captured. I couldn't breathe. "You followed me?" I whispered. Gary didn't shout, didn't flinch. "I watched you lie for weeks," he said, his voice hollow. I needed to know how far it went. I covered my mouth with my hand. "I need one day," I whispered. "Please. One day." He stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. "You have it." The next morning, I walked Matthew to school myself, holding his backpack while he double-checked his pencil case, smoothing his shirt collar before he disappeared inside. He looked back once and smiled, and for a moment, I wanted time to stop, to freeze me right there, on the steps of the school, before everything shattered. Matthew passed all of his exams. Straight A's across the board. Dalton messaged me a few hours later. "We did it. Come celebrate. I made reservations. Just you and me." I stared at the screen, then turned it off. I didn't reply. That night, I made dinner like usual. Gary didn't sit down to eat. Matthew didn't ask questions. I cleaned the table slowly, wiped down the counters, stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, and then I walked to the bedroom, pulled an old duffel bag from the closet, and began packing in slow, quiet motions. I didn't take much. A sweater, a few essentials. No makeup, no phone, no photos. Just a note I left on the kitchen counter. "Tell Matthew I'm proud of him." Then I opened the front door and stepped into the rain. I didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, didn't take the car. I just walked. Because sometimes, the only way to survive a choice is to vanish into it completely.